Hi, and welcome to English Digest. I'm Seb.
And I'm Elsie.
And we're here today looking at this month's graph writing assignment. So, Elsie, I have to ask you first question. Are you good with money?
Am I good with money?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Because I want to save more money every month. So I'm trying to do it, but I think I fail all the time.
Okay, right. So you're not so good with money. You're not so good at controlling your expenses.
Right.
You know,
I like to
not
spend
spending
money,
too much.
Which is not good. What about you?
Me, I think I'm also kind of like that. I want to be good with money. I definitely try to keep a budget, like an 预算, and work out what I need to spend each month and what I've been spending money on. There's some really good apps you can use to track what you're spending money on. But I don't know. I'm a bit of a big spender sometimes. If I've had a really stressful week and then I go and meet my friends for dinner on Saturday or something like that, then I'll be like, I don't care. I'm going to throw all my money in this restaurant.
I hear you.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to eliminate unnecessary spending, like the money I spend on clothes, shoes, food, drinks.
Exactly. Your expenses. Now, expense is the key word of today's episode. An expense, or expenses is the plural, is something that we spend money on. That could be every day, it could be every week, it could be every month, or it could be at a specific time, like on a vacation, for example. We could talk about your travel expenses. So, Elsie, what would be some examples of monthly expenses that we all have to pay?
Monthly expenses, 每个月的开销. Actually, there's a lot, right? Like we have to pay our bills, electricity bills, phone bills, internet bills. All those are expenses.
Yes, and
food?
Obviously that big bill on the place that you live in. Of course, we don't call that a bill, we call it your rent. Your 房租. So paying for where you live, paying for the internet, the electricity you use, and all of that. Okay, so some people are very good at that. They keep a strict budget. They don't spend too much money. And other people live month to month. So, Elsie, do you know what living month to month means?
Can you explain that for us?
So, living month to month means to spend all the money that you earn each month, or to not earn enough money so you really kind of have to struggle to get to the end of the month. So I think it's kind of like 月光族.
月光族, exactly.
You might not be earning a lot of money, or you might just be terrible at controlling your expenses. Either way, you could say you live month to month. So do you live month to month, Elsie?
I used to, but not now anymore.
Definitely when I was 18, I lived month to month. Definitely got to the last 5 days of the month and thought, oh my God, I don't have any money left.
I can't eat.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to have white rice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm also glad to say that I don't live month to month anymore. All right, let's move on now to our topic and instructions and see what we're going to be doing with all this information about expenses. So, Elsie, could you tell us a bit about today's assignment?
OK, 今天呢，我们要看到的提示是下方长条图啊，呈现的是台湾高中生的主要开销项目，就是我们刚才讨论的 expenses。那除了正餐啦、服饰和交通之外，每一位受访者他要选3项他们主要的开销项目哦。请你根据图表的内容撰写一篇英文作文，文长至少是120个单词，文章至少分为2段。第一段呢，你要描述图表的内容；第二段则要描述你自己平常主要的开销项目为何，并说明你的理由。
So in English, the bar graph above is about Taiwanese high school students' major expenses, so the things they spend the most money on, excluding 3 meals a day and transportation. Students are asked to choose 3 categories they spend most of their money on. Please write an essay of at least 120 words with 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph should explain the contents of the graph. In the second paragraph, talk about what your major expenses are and explain why you have spent money on these things. Okay, so we're learning a useful skill here. What we're practicing here is looking for trends, 趋势, and expressing or looking at it for interesting information in the graph. This is a really useful skill for lots of jobs, whether you want to be a journalist or a scientist or a designer, and it's also very useful for when you go to university, not just for studying English. So when do you think it might be useful to compare how much money high school students spend every day? Who might be interested in this kind of data? Who might want to know, like, what they're spending?
Their teachers or their parents.
Yeah, that would be a really good point, especially if you're giving pocket money or an allowance. Or it could be maybe the school, if the school is planning to make some changes, like opening a new cafeteria or opening a cafe or opening some kind of shop. They might want to know what the students are interested in buying, and a graph like this would be very useful. So in today's assignment, you want to write at least 120 words and use some of that to talk about your own major expenses. Keep that in mind as we go through today's assignment. As you look at the data, you can make comparisons between it and your own experiences, as well as look for what's different.
再来呢，我们要进到的是 develop and approach 的地方。那我们在发展的时候呢，我们要注意的是本篇它是图表写作，所以图表写作所呈现的是统计数字 statistics 事实 facts 数据的分布情形 distributions 和调查或报告的说明 explanations。那常见的步骤呢，是第一个，分析图表，确实描述图表所传递的讯息；第二个，解读图表的内容，描述图表中呢具有意义而且值得描述的数值，或者是比较其相对的关系；第三个就是根据图表的内容，适时加入自己的看法、推论或实际的例证，以呼应主题。
Good points. When writing about graphs, data, or statistics, you need to assume that the reader doesn't know how to read the information themselves. Many people don't have a good understanding of data or statistics, so a good start for your introduction can be to first explain what they're looking at. Okay? So good things to include in your explanation might be what the axes represent. Axes, by the way, or axis, that's the singular form of axes. Those are the lines in most graphs that go along the bottom horizontally and on the left from top to bottom. And sometimes you can have like a four-way axes of organizing a graph. Another thing you could think about is what the numbers represent. So obviously your graph is going to have lots of numbers. Do those represent people? Do they represent money? Is it temperature? Is it the amount of rain that's been falling? It could mean a lot of things. So make sure that the person reading understands what you're looking at.
那再来呢，第二个，如同一般文章的起承转合，图表写作的内容必须完全符合图表中的资讯哦。首先要清楚的理解本图表的主题是什么，主题非常重要。然后呢，图表中的统计数字或符号，就我们刚刚说到的，好，那些分别代表什么你也可以说。再来就是呢，其中有没有哪一项最突出，你可以来做讨论。那依提示说明，第一段你必须要指出各项分别为何，然后呢要客观，注意是客观分析图表显示的资讯，避免添加过多的个人观点。然后第二段才可以将自己的经验融入到写作里头，描述自己主要的开销项目是什么。
Right, good point. We want our argument to be convincing, and for that reason, you don't want to be too opinionated at the beginning of your passage. People don't want to be told what to think. Instead, present the facts and then lead your reader in the direction you want them to go. It's much more effective.
好，再来呢，第三个我们要注意的是，除了内容流畅完整之外文法结构、组织、字词的搭配、修辞等技巧的自然运用也都很重要哦。所以呢，先求能够正确的使用字句来描述数值的变化，再来尝试使用不同的单字来表达，增加文章的深度。然而呢，与其挑选艰深晦涩而且难易不协调的字词，或者是复杂易错的句子，不如用简单易懂的字词和清楚有把握的句子来做你文章里面的陈述叙述哦。
Before we begin writing our passage, I think it would actually be a good idea if we go over the different kinds of graphs that might come up in your exams. Because today we're looking at a bar chart or a bar graph, but there are other ones as well that could very easily be appearing on your big exam day. So take a look at your magazines now and you'll see we have 5 different kinds of graphs or charts that can be used to help us interpret data. The first one we've got here is the pie chart. A pie chart basically obviously looks like a pie. It's circular and it has wedges, okay? And these wedges can be used to explain percentages or composition. So, how much of a thing is in another thing. The next one we can look at here is the bar graph. Now, we call a bar graph because obviously the data is expressed in what looks like kind of like skyscrapers or candy bars, they're kind of big, long rectangles. And we use bar graphs normally to talk about relative data. So talking about different things and what their relative value is. And this is also the one that we're going to be using in today's assignment. Elsie, do you want to take us through one of the next graphs?
Okay, so I'll talk about the tree graph. Tree graph 在中文里面呢是树状图. So you can think of the top box as the root and connect the root, the top box, with smaller boxes below. 再这样连下来，好，所以由最上面的格子连下来下面的框框，那你就可以 think of them as the tree's leaves. 好，然后呢，你就可以把最重要的东西放在顶点，然后呢，再把细项写出来。再来还有 two more, right? What about line chart?
Right, line charts are very useful, especially if you do things like economics or even if you study history. And that's because we often use line charts to talk about changes to data over time. As you can see, line charts, as the name suggests, present the data in lines, okay? So they go from the bottom left corner and progress towards the right. And basically, with a line chart, what we're doing is we're showing how things increase or decrease over time. And lastly, let's look at this radar chart. Now, a radar chart obviously looks like a radar. And if you're not familiar with radars, they're basically kind of they're devices that in the past we would use to locate maybe ships or other people in our vicinity, so around us. So in an old radar, you would be the center of the star, and then somebody who is around you would appear relative to you on this map. So they might be in front of you, they might be behind you, etc. Now, with a radar chart, we're measuring different qualities of the same thing.
OK, 所以最后两种呢，我们看到的有 line chart 折线图，还有 radar chart 也就是雷达图。那再说一次，我们今天要用的是 bar graph 长条图的部分。所以呢 ，Are we going to take a look at our bar graph for today?
Yes. So we've talked about a lot of graphs here. We're not going to be talking about all of them in our assignment. That would be very, very difficult. But we are going to be talking about this bar chart that you guys have in your magazines. So let's take a look at it now. And we can see that this is a bar chart representing
all the high school students in Taiwan.
In Taiwan. Oh, so it's a very big survey we're looking at here.
I think so.
So the title is telling us that it is these students and what they normally spend their money on, except for their food and their transportation and their clothing. So here they've decided to use the left to talk about a percentage of the students' expenses, so how much of their money they're spending on each thing. On the bottom, the x-axis shows the different kinds of things that they might be buying. So the first one here we have is snacks. We also have drinks, then stationery, video games, travel, film, and KTV. So lots of different things they could be spending money on. And we've also separated these bars according to their gender. So we have how much that boys are spending and how much that girls are spending.
所以呢，刚刚 Seb 一提到的就是最重要的 topic， 好，那个主题非常的重要，所以我们今天图表上方的主题你要看清楚之外呢，那个 X 轴它代表的是学生们他们的 expenses， 然后纵轴就是 percentage， 好，所以要搞清楚之后再开始去发展你的文章，再开始做这个 brainstorm 的动作。
Yes, exactly. This is a really good brainstorming exercise. You can perhaps use a mind map or something similar to just note down all the different things you could say about this graph. So what can we tell from this graph? We know what we can see, but what does this information tell us?
Okay, so first, we can see that they spend most of their money on snacks, on drinks.
Right, exactly. So we can see here that 49% and 50% of boys and girls, respectively, are spending most of their money on snacks, or it's one of their three main things that they spend money on. So that's a lot of people. That's a very clear trend. We can also see that girls probably prefer stationery more than boys. And that's because in this second section, we can see that 43%, so that's close to half of girls, said that it was one of their main expenses, while only a quarter of boys said it was one of their main expenses. So we can see a strong trend there that indicates a preference, one of the girls' preferences. Can we see another difference between gender in this chart, Elsie?
Yes, we can see that boys enjoy video games more than the girls.
And how can we tell that? How can we tell that they prefer video games?
Because we saw 12% of the boys like to play video games, like to spend money on video games, while there's only 2% of the girls like to spend their money on the video games.
Yeah, so very few girls are spending their money on video games. So there's a strong indication there. And lastly, there are some similarities with travel and film and KTV. These ones have a slight gender bias, but they're quite similar. Now, a gender bias just means that some data leans more to one gender or the other. So it doesn't have to be a big difference. Here, obviously, with KTV, we can see it's 14% and 12%. There's a slight gender bias there, but it's not that different. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about what is implied by the graph. Okay, just now we talked about what we can see, what we can interpret, and lastly, what is implied. So implied means not expressly said. It's something that's suggested, okay? So, for example, it shows what they're spending their pocket money on, but it doesn't include living costs and transport and other things like that. So it's implied that this is the student's own money, I think we can say. This isn't their parents' money, or at least it's their allowance.
Yeah, it's their allowance, their pocket money.
The money that they are free to spend. They don't have to ask their parents to buy these things.
Right.
Are there any other things that we might want to say are implied?
也就是从图表中看得出 maybe 一点点的讯息，然后你需要去多做一些解释。So maybe I can say they need to eat snacks to focus on their schoolwork. So they spend so much money on the food.
Yes, exactly. Or we could maybe say, use this, it implies that we need to have healthier snacks as well, because students eat a lot of snacks, and if snacks are very unhealthy,
that's right,
then that's not going to be very good for their bodies.
Yes.
So why are we spending so much time on this brainstorming section? Why have we spent so much time talking about what we can see, what the data represents, and what the graph implies? Well, because this is the basic structure that you want your assignment to follow. You want to begin with the most obvious things, then the stuff that requires a little bit of explanation, explaining the data. And lastly, you want to be expanding on that and talking about the effects and the implications of this data. And this is kind of where you can weave in a little bit of your personal experience as well. Okay, let's move on now and look at our outline, because I think we have a lot that we can put into our passage. So now we have plenty of information to work with. We're going to want to plan out what we want to say in our actual passage, and that's where the outline comes in. Remember, an outline is a device that helps you organize your ideas so you can create a logical passage. So you don't spend too much time on your introduction or your conclusion, so you have a good amount of balance in your passage. Now, our structure is obviously going to include a topic sentence, that's a sentence that sets out your main points, and then supporting information. And we can do this for our introduction, we can do it for our main paragraphs, we can do it for our conclusion. Here, I think we're going to want to just do 3 topic sentences, one for the main first paragraph, one for the second paragraph, and one just for the conclusion. So let's take a look now at the first paragraph. This bar graph shows what high school students spend their money on. Okay, so that's our first topic sentence. The following points are, it doesn't include meals, clothing, or transportation to and from school. Around 50% of both boys and girls spend lots of money on drinks and snacks. The next most popular items are books and stationery. And only 2% of girls spent a lot of money on video games, while 12% of boys did. Okay, so obviously our topic sentence here is explaining the purpose of the graph. It's making it very clear. And that's something you want to do too. You want to write your topic sentences in very clear, easy-to-read language. And then we've also got this line, around 50% of both boys and girls spend a lot of money on food and drinks. Now, this is good, but I think one thing that could be added is to explain the axes before. So you've got what the graph means, then you can go into a little bit more detail about what we can see in the graph as well, before going into what the data means.
好，所以呢，你们会看到呢，第一段它的主题句是点出长条图的主题哦，就是我们刚刚也在强调的。然后呢，再点出较高比例的花费，再点出次高。接下来呢，再点出较少的花费，还有男女之间的不同，你也可以提一下。那这边呢，要是客观的，好，不加入自己主观的意见。到了等一下的第二段，再说明自己的花费项目，并且呢，一定要记得跟图表做连接。所以我们看到主题句第二句 ，Topic Sentence 2 I try not to spend too much on snacks and drinks. I prefer to save my money for school things or activities I can enjoy with my friends. These include traveling on weekends and going to the KTV.So the writer here spends more money on traveling and going to the KTV, and she points that out in the second paragraph. 她在第二段点出自己在花费的项目上面跟这个图表上面的不同哦，所以她很巧妙的将第一段没有描述到的部分，后面的这一些玩乐的部分放到第二段点出，并且跟自身的经验做连结、做对比。
Lastly, we have our conclusion, which is, I think these things are more meaningful than a cup of bubble tea. Okay, so with your conclusion, you can either talk about what might happen in the future, or you could give your opinion. This is a good place to give your opinion, actually, because you've stated all of the facts, and so what you say is going to be much more credible, much more believable. Okay, let's take a break, and after that, we will come back and look at some writing tips in the sample. Basic sample. This bar graph shows what high school students spend their money on. It doesn't include meals, clothing, or transportation to and from school. The graph shows that around 50% of both boys and girls spend lots of money on drinks and snacks. The next most popular items are books and stationery. However, according to the graph, 43% of girls said this was one of the main things they spent money on. By contrast, only 23% of boys said this. On the other hand, only 2% of girls said they spent a lot of money on video games, while 12% of boys said they did. Personally, I try not to spend too much on snacks and drinks. I prefer to save my money for school things or activities I can enjoy with my friends. These include traveling on weekends and going to the KTV. I think these are more meaningful than a cup of bubble tea.
Okay, 所以这一篇呢，基本的这一篇作文啊，有几个地方我们可以跟他学习，像是呢，我们要来描述图表的时候，首先他说 This bar graph shows something， 当然我们也可以选用不同的动词，像是 displays， 好，我们在等一下比较难的那一篇会看到。再来呢，第二个，你要说图表包含什么，不包含什么，我们可以用 include 这个动词，所以呢 it includes or it doesn't include， 然后你可以带出它所包含跟没有包含的项目。再来呢，当你要提到图表的时候，你可以用 according to the graph， 也就是根据这项图表，然后再写出你想要描述它所表示出来的东西是什么。然后呢，当你做到要讲相反的东西的时候，你可以用 by contrast。不过呢，它通常放在句首。你要用到句中的时候呢，你可以用 while 这个连接词，好，都是代表可以带出相反的事物。再来第二段呢，它开头的时候要提到自己，对不对？所以它用了一个副词 personally。
Exactly. So, as Elsie's gone through some of the language, I will give a couple of tips on how you can write the passage structure as well. So, I think I really enjoyed this passage, but one thing that I think it lacked is it didn't really tell us how the data was gathered, and it didn't really explain what we can see in the graph so much. It didn't talk about the graph itself. So after the first sentence, we could add some more information about how this information was gathered. We could say, for example, students in high schools across Taiwan were asked to say the 3 main things they spent their money on. Or we could say the x-axis in this graph represents the percentage of students, while the y-axis represents the percentage of students, while the x-axis shows the different things that students are spending their money on. So that's something you can add at the beginning to have a kind of more detailed passage. Okay, let's move on now to the advanced sample. Advanced sample. This bar graph displays the major categories of expenses paid by high school students. In the survey, each student could select 3 categories, but excluded their meal, clothing, and transportation costs from their answers. According to the chart, approximately half of both boys and girls said that snacks and beverages were one of their major expenses. Many students also rated books and stationery as a significant expense. But there was divergence between the genders. 43% of girls classified books and stationery as a big drain on their financial resources, whereas only 23% of boys did. Meanwhile, 12% of boys forked out a lot of money on video games, while only 2% of girls did. Other categories of expenses include travel costs, as well as forms of entertainment like movies and KTV. I will guiltily hold my hand up as one of the majority. I do spend a good chunk of my allowance on snacks and drinks. I often need a bit of extra food and sugar to keep my energy levels up as I go from my regular classes to my cram school classes. I think it's strange that so few girls spend their money on video games, though. Most of my friends and I play them, and we use real money to buy in-game rewards. Maybe we're in the minority. But after class, it's nice to unwind by playing games on my phone as I take the MRT home. It's treats like snacks, drinks, and games that make the long school days bearable. Okay, so obviously this one has some much more complicated language. I think we should probably focus on that. Firstly, let's look at a couple of the phrasal verbs here, because we've got a couple of good ones. Forked out and hold one's hand up. So forked out, meanwhile 12% of boys forked out a lot of money. That means to spend a lot of money. You're not meaning to. So it sounds a bit negative, I think, forked out. It sounds kind of like you think that they're spending too much money.
OK, 所以他的意思是比较负面一点的，在讲他花很多的钱在某件事情上面。再来呢，还有一个副词 approximately， 它是大约。那在基础版里面我们用 about 用 around， 那在进阶版我们要用到这个比较难的副词哦。那还有一个 what about divergence?
Divergence, right. So a divergence is basically a difference, we could say. That's the easiest way of putting it. So there was a difference between the genders. There was a divergence. However, I think divergence also has a little bit to do with movement as well. So when you have divergence, it means things are different, but they are getting more different. Okay? So here we're talking about stationery, divergence between boys and girls in stationery. So we can say there's a difference in how many girls like stationery and how many boys did. And next, I also want to look at this phrase bearable. Something that's bearable is something that you can endure. So we're saying something which might not be that pleasant, might not be relaxing, but at least you can get through it. That's basically what they're saying. By having these snacks, I can get through my school day. All right, well, I think that's all the time we have for today's episode. We're going to be joining you in a few days to talk about this month's translation exercise. But until then, we will see you then. All right, for English Digest, I'm Seb.
I'm Elsie. Bye.
Bye.